Hi there, nice to be with you. Happy you could stick around.
1, 2, 3, kick! Come on, everybody. Clap your hands. Ooh, you're looking good.
Welcome to the first chapter of the Trouser Press Books podcast, an occasional production, the purpose of which is to shed some audio light on the people behind our books. I'm Ira Robbins, editorial director of Trouser Press Books. Back in 1974, I co-founded Trouser Press magazine, so yes, I've been at this a very long time. Our first guest is Andrew Humphreys, whose London-based company Paradise Road published the book Marquee, the story of the world's greatest music venue in 2022. As we've recently released the American paperback edition, we've got Andrew here to tell us more about the book and the legendary club on Wardour Street in Soho. So welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Grizzled rock fans will certainly have seen the old Who poster advertising Maximum R&B Tuesdays at the Marquee. Why don't you tell us a bit more about the club?
The Marquee, it started off as a jazz club in '58, launched by a guy called Harold Pendleton. He set it up as a jazz club. He was a big jazz fan. Ran it for about 4 years on its original site on Oxford Street. And although he was a jazz fan, around about sort of 62, you got this new music scene happening in the UK, which was R&B. Not R&B as is known in America. This was old-timey Chicago blues, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, that sort of thing. Became a big fad in the UK in the early 60s. Harold was a jazz fan, but he was also an accountant who cared about money. He could see which way the wind was blowing, so he started to put on R&B bands on a Thursday night at the Marquee, which was slow night for business. He was getting the crowds in, so eventually the R&B moved from Thursdays to Friday, Saturday, Sunday. The Marquee moved to the location most people know it at, which is Wardour Street, the heart of Soho, where it would remain for the next 25 years. And R&B sort of morphed into rock by about 64, 65, and the Marquee then became a rock venue. In the move, the sort of jazz was lost, and Harold ended up running a rock club, which hosted just about every band, bar the Beatles, every band of note that played London played at the Marquee.
So we're talking like the Yardbirds and the Rolling Stones and the Who.
The Marquee really became the house club for R&B, and the big R&B bands were the three you name, but also people like Manfred Mann, Moody Blues, Long John Baldry. 64, 65, 66 were sort of the glory years of the Marquee. But what happened with the Marquee, they were savvy enough as music styles changed, the Marquee kept up to date with the bands. So R&B sort of morphed into, power trios like Cream, blues rock, Led Zeppelin, they all played the Marquee. Later on, it moved into psychedelia and prog, the likes of Yes and Genesis. They all had, significant Marquee gigs. And on into the 70s with pub rock, punk, new wave, Marquee became home to so many different tribes of music.
So the book begins with an epigram by Lemmy, the famous late bass player and singer of Motorhead, who says, "The reason I liked the Marquee was because it was scruffy and a hellhole, and your feet stuck to the floor, and that's exactly what a rock and roll club should be like." Is that your memory of your personal memory of the Marquee as well?
Yeah, I mean, the Marquee was not the most welcoming of clubs. I mean, what I remember about it, I used to go there in the mid-'80s, which was not exactly a golden age for the music, but I still loved the club because, like Lemmy says, it felt exactly like, as a teenage boy, what you expected a rock and roll club to be. You entered down this long, dark corridor. There was no frontage to the club. There was just a set of glass doors. You walked down this long corridor, which was lined with posters of previous acts that had played there, Hendrix, the Stones, the Who. You entered into the bar, where a lot of journalists, music management types hung out. And then there was a set of double doors. You pushed through that into an auditorium that looked like an underground bomb shelter. It was all black, no windows, entirely dark, low ceiling, low stage. Felt it only took about 600 people, so it filled up pretty fast. And yeah, you couldn't see the floor, but I mean, your feet stuck to it. It was
Should.
yeah, and also in the 80s, and everybody smoked. So you walked into this sort of hanging cloud of cigarette smoke. Famously, the one thing that you remember about it as a fan is the heat and the fact that, as everybody that was interviewed mentioned, it actually seemed to rain inside because the heat from bodies and people's breath condensed on the ceiling, which wasn't far above your head, condensed and then dripped back down onto the audience.
It's kind of hard to explain to people who don't like this sort of thing why this is all positive, because it sounds awful.
It was just the atmosphere. I mean, you grew up listening to rock and roll, and it was sort of dirty and gritty and grungy if they were doing it right. And this was the physical manifestation of this. I mean, I grew up in the north of England. We didn't have clubs like this. I moved down to London to go to the Marquee because as a kind of school kid, I would buy NME and Melody Maker and Sounds every week, and I would look at the lists of the gigs that are taking place in London, and the Marquee ads always stood out because they had a really specific logo and they were boxed, so they stood out from the rest, and they also had great bands. So I always dreamt of going to the Marquee, and when you got there, it didn't disappoint. It was absolutely everything you wanted from a rock club.
The book chronicles the club as well as the huge Reading Festival that the club created and managed over a 30-year history. Can you share some of the highlights from the book?
Oh boy, I mean, where'd you start? I make the claim on the front of the book, the world's greatest music venue. I'm sure there are people would take issue with that. But when you look at the roll call of artists, and not, you get a lot of venues where lots of well-known artists have played, but the Marquee actually played a significant role in so many artists' careers. The biggie, you start off with the Rolling Stones. Their first ever gig was at the Marquee. They'd never played together before, and they were asked to fill in for Blues Incorporated. So it was a fill-in gig, and Brian Jones pulled a kind of spec band together. They didn't have Bill Wyman then, they didn't have Charlie Watts, but it was the first time that Brian Jones, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Ian Stewart played together under the name of the Rolling Stones. After that, you get the Yardbirds. They had a residency at the Marquee. Their first album was recorded live at the Marquee. Marquee provided a platform for the Yardbirds, who had Eric Clapton as their guitarist at that time.
So we're now incorporating a series of Eric and Sam singing together, and me not singing, another called Good Morning Little Schoolgirl.
Eric was inspired to buy his first electric guitar after seeing Blues Incorporated at the Marquee. The Yardbirds were later back at the Marquee playing with first Jeff Beck and then Jimmy Page. Then you've got The Who. The Who had, I think it was a 23-week residency at the Marquee. Beginning of the residency, they were largely unknown beyond their core fan base out in West London. At the end of the 23 weeks, they'd been on TV, they'd had their first single recorded, and they'd made a name as possibly the best live act in the UK, all on the back of a Marquee residency. David Bowie played the Marquee over 30 times. This was pre-Ziggy Stardust, but this was where David Bowie kind of learnt his trade, how to engage with an audience. He met Mick Ronson for the first time at the Marquee, and when he retired Ziggy, although the final Ziggy Stardust concert was at the Hammersmith Odeon, he did another gig at the Marquee, which was a recording for NBC, a TV special called the 1980 Floor Show, and that was the last time you saw the Ziggy persona. So in a way, David Bowie said goodbye to Ziggy at the Marquee. The list goes on and on and on. Key gigs for Fleetwood Mac, for Cream, for Led Zeppelin, all took place at the Marquee. Later on, the first club gig the Sex Pistols did was the Marquee, after which they were promptly banned and never allowed to play it again. And some surprising artists, later artists. U2 had an early residency at the Marquee. A lot of new wave acts did. The first time Guns N' Roses ever played outside of basically, I think, West Coast America was a series of 3 gigs at the Marquee. So throughout its history, it had sort of 25 years of providing a platform for bands to break into the big time. And one reason that this happened a lot at the Marquee was because the Marquee was where all the journalists hung out. So the bands would get their first press exposure through a gig at the Marquee. They may well pick up an agent or a manager at the Marquee because they tended to hang out at the bar there. The bar was the big meeting place for the music industry, so that's why bands wanted to play there. They would get exposure if they were any good. This was the launching pad.
The bar didn't always serve alcohol, did it?
No, at the beginning.
Which is kind of an amazing concept, right? I mean, a bar and a rock club and you can't get a beer.
Yeah, pre-70, they couldn't get a license. What happened was the sort of licensing committee was sewn up by pub landlords who didn't want competition. So it was really hard to get a new drinks license. And it took the best part of 10 years for the Marquee to get an alcohol license. In the meantime, they served Coca-Cola and Mars bars. But
How punk rock,
yeah. But they had their own drinking club. Now, this was not available to the audience members, but next door to the Marquee, one of the managers of the club had acquired a late night drinking club. So it was above a betting shop. You went up a steep staircase and it was up on the first floor. It was called La Chasse. And that also was a venue for any bands and the roadies that were playing the Marquee could drink there. It was also, again, where the music press, music management hung out. It was such a music hangout that it even had its own football team, which at one point John Anderson of Yes and Phil Collins were both members of the football club. It was a notorious haunt of Keith Moon, who memorably once arrived at the club via the windows. He'd walk from the Who offices across the rooftops of Soho and entered the club via its first floor window.
As one does.
Yeah.
So the book has a list of artists in the back who performed the most often at the Marquee. Here's a list of the top 10 people who played there more than 50 times, 50. Long John Baldry, Manfred Mann, and these are in different incarnations. They weren't all under their own name. Gary Farr and the T-Bones, the Mark Lehman Five, Cyril Davis, Timebox and Pato, Dumpy's Rusty Nuts, Brian Auger, and Jimmy James and the Vagabonds. I'm kind of surprised to find Mark Lehman on that list because from what I've been able to dig up, they were kind of like a beat-era pop group who did covers of American soul and blues songs like Green Onions and Got My Mojo Working.
Got my mojo working, but it just don't work for you.
They released exactly 4 UK 45s, none of which charted, and the namesake singer was killed in an auto accident in 1965. Yet they had a residence at the Marquee and appeared on its stage a whopping 87 times. Somebody must have liked them.
They were actually hugely popular. I interviewed Barbara Pendleton. By the time we were doing this book, Harold Pendleton had died, so I never met him, but the author of the book, Robert, had interviewed Harold, a number of times. Unfortunately, I came on board with the project after Harold had gone. I interviewed Barbara, and she said that her favourite band that she ever saw at the Marquee was the Mark Lehman Five. She said they were terrific. And I suspect the reason that they're not better known is exactly as you said, their lead singer died. And you've got to remember when the Stones started out, they were a covers band. The Who started out, they were a covers band. So Mark Lehman Five weren't unusual in that. They would have been playing exactly the same sort of material as the Stones. All of those bands, the Yardbirds, they were all drawing their act from American blues artists. So, had Mark Lehman not had a premature death, it's quite possible that, the Mark Lehman Five would have been the next Stones. They started off coming out of the same scene, but the death of the singer kind of put an end to their career.
It's kind of amazing, though, that they could play there so often and not sell a lot of records. I mean, you'd think that the audience that came to see them, that warranted them being booked over and over and over again, would have bought their singles at least enough to get them in the charts, but apparently it didn't work out that way. So
maybe it could be that they didn't actually tour much outside of London.
That could be.
I've known other bands who were just kind of content to play the Marquee and gig around London. You get a strong fan base in London, but it's not going to do much for your record sales.
Yeah. And who in God's name are Dumpy's Rusty Nuts?
Dumpy's Rusty Nuts I have actually seen, because Dumpy's Rusty Nuts were one of those bands that filled up the Marquee schedules in the 80s. As I said, the 80s when I was going to the Marquee was not the best time for music at the Marquee. I'd missed out on punk and new wave and post-punk. When I was going to the Marquee in the mid-80s, it was a lot of goth bands. There was a kind of new progressive rock scene, bands like Marillion, and it was also the sort of dregs of British rock. And Dumpies were a biker rock band, and they appealed to a biker crowd. And they sang songs about motorbiking, and they were hugely popular. The Dumpy was so called because he was indeed dumpy, and they were fun. I mean, the music, you probably wouldn't go home and listen to it much, but in a kind of, dark, smoky, beery club, they were the perfect fit for the Marquee. And they had such a huge, loyal fan base.
Crazy. And they never made any impression whatsoever in the United States. I've never even heard of them before this.
I think probably most people outside of, the Marquee circle have heard of them.
So the book has a lot of great stories in it about some of the, a lot of bands, but including some of the stadium bands that you really wouldn't expect to find on the stage of a 600 capacity club on a small street in central London. Is Soho central London, or is it considered?
No. Soho is dead central.
Okay.
I mean, you could not be more central than the Marquee Club. Hence its popularity with rock journalists. It means they didn't have to travel very far.
At least one of the papers had its offices on Carnaby Street, which is literally around the corner.
A lot of the music press was in that area. The Marquee was just so convenient.
Sounds was in Longacre.
Longacre is a 5-minute walk from the Marquee.
Okay. I mean, there's a lot of bands that played there. You mentioned a lot of them before, but I mean, it's kind of incredible to read about, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, Genesis, Yes, Roxy Music, Dire Straits, Guns N' Roses, AC/DC, U2, David Bowie, even Metallica played the Marquee.
One of the great things about the Marquee was bands, even though the dressing rooms were notoriously awful, they were smaller than the average bus shelter, with worse facilities than a bus shelter. But bands loved playing the Marquee, and they loved it so much that, 10 years after they last played there, some of the bands would come back and do secret gigs. The Jam came back under the name John's Boys. So these would be advertised in the press under a fake name. So the Jam played as John's Boys.
John being Paul Weller's dad, who
John
managed
was
the band.
Paul Weller's manager.
Yep.
Paul Weller's dad and the band's manager.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. The Police came back because they did an early residency there, kind of about the time they recorded the first album. And then they came back a few albums later and played as the Aces. Iron Maiden did a secret
that's the
gig.
Ace Face from the Quadrophenia role that Sting played.
Exactly.
You got to know your rock history in order to figure these out.
Iron Maiden came back. The name they used was the entire population of Hackney. Hackney being a borough of London. I have no idea of the derivation of that. Marillion came back. I think they called themselves like Lufthansa Airlines, something like that. No idea. Probably the biggest gig of these secret gigs was Genesis, because Genesis played a whole bunch of dates in the early 70s, Peter Gabriel days. They particularly liked the Marquee because their manager, Tony Stratton Smith, had offices upstairs. So they played quite a few times. Probably their last gig was about 1972. 1982, by this time, Genesis was, fronted by Phil Collins. They were playing stadiums. They were playing to 20,000 people. 1982, they came back to the Marquee and played to 500 people. And they advertised themselves as the Garden Wall, which, as any Genesis fan knows, was the name of one of the schoolboy bands that Genesis emerged out of at Charterhouse. Yeah, so if you knew your rock history, you could, if you were lucky, nab a ticket for one of these, very special secret gigs.
And sweated and came home covered in smoke.
Yeah. But, to see a band that normally plays 20,000 people and be one of 500 people.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there have been a lot of those kind of amazing gigs. I mean, I saw Bob Dylan in the Supper Club in New York. And I saw Clapton in the Supper Club. They were doing like these special shows for one reason or another.
Right.
And I had good credentials in the press of those days and was able to get in. And it was just kind of, you don't expect to be able to see somebody that famous that close.
It still happens occasionally. The 100 Club is still going in London, which was kind of contemporaneous with the Marquee, set up around the same time. And occasionally, I remember about 5 years ago, Paul McCartney did a secret gig.
The company I was working for sent a reporter over to cover that.
Right. So not that secret.
Well, it wasn't secret in the industry.
Yeah.
So one of the most amazing things about the book is sort of the digging into the histories so that you find out about people who became really, really famous later, who played the Marquee when they weren't famous. So you see people like Elton John and Rod Stewart and Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck and Jimi Hendrix all the way through to Billy Idol and the Police, who weren't well known when they first played the Marquee. So it's kind of amazing to sort of learn backwards all the stuff that happened before you became aware of these artists.
Yeah, I mean, because when these bands are playing the Marquee, they're not playing, at the height of their fame. It's early days. So, most every band you saw there was then pretty unknown. They were in the process of building up their fan base. And yeah, I mean, you go back through the Marquee, you say The Cure had an early 4-date residency. And there's one particular evening, The Cure was supported by Joy Division. I mean, what a gig that must have been. But at that time, nobody really knew who The Cure or Joy Division was. REM were there when they did Murmur. The Human League were there. So, you might get lucky and see a band that you didn't know who they were, and then several years later they're a stadium band, or in my case you would see dozens of bands you would never ever hear of again.
It always helps if you write these things down, because like 10 years later you might not even realize you'd seen them.
Yeah. I not at the Marquee, but I remember going to see an Elvis Costello gig, and I didn't remember the support band, but 20 years later I looked in my diary and found that the support band had been the Waterboys.
I once saw a show in New York at the Beacon Theater, and I think it was Rory Gallagher headlining, and the opening act was this Canadian trio that I really thought were awful. They were called Rush.
Yeah.
And they played for half an hour, and like nobody paid any attention, and the next time I saw them, they were headlining Madison Square Garden, and that was 20 years later.
Yeah.
So, but it's kind of incredible. And the admission in the 70s and the 60s was probably like £1.50 or something like that.
It was less than the price of a beer. I mean, in the 80s, I seem to remember it being about the £1 mark. It was less than you'd pay for your Guinness once you got in.
Which, of course, Guinness is now £8.
Yeah.
But times have changed. The book goes into a lot about the Marquee's festival business, and so that started because Harold Pendleton was involved with the National Jazz Organization, and that he decided to stage a jazz festival.
Yeah.
And amazingly, over the years, that led to the huge and famous and important Reading Festival.
Yeah, because this was another part of the appeal. You might think, if this club was so kind of grotty, why did bands want to play? Another reason was because Harold, he set up a jazz festival, early days of the club, 1961. He wanted to expose jazz to as big an audience as possible. He wanted to get jazz out of this dingy basement in Soho and present it to, a lot more people. So he started a festival in 61 in a field in Richmond in southwest London. But much like the club, within 3 years of starting the festival, it had been taken over by acts like the Rolling Stones, the Animals, the Who, the Moody Blues, the Yardbirds. So from a jazz festival, within about 3 or 4 years, it had become effectively a rock festival. And then while the citizens of Richmond, which is a very kind of well-to-do, wealthy part of southwest London, they would put up with the jazz fans. They were not prepared to put up with rock fans. And there was a concerted letter-writing campaign to get rid of the jazz festival, which happened. So it moved, and I think it went through about 3 or 4 different locations. They all tended to be race courses around the edges of London, until eventually in, I think, 67 or 68, it settled in Reading, where it's remained ever since. It continues today as the world's longest continuous running rock festival. And so, yeah, if you played the Marquee and you went down well and had a following, then you had a very good chance of getting a slot at the next Reading Festival, which was big time. You would be playing to 20, 30,000 people instead of 500.
It's funny because when you read the book, you get the sense that the Reading, because of what you just said, that the bands who were popular at the Marquee became headliners at Reading. Like now you think of the Reading Festival as being like whoever the biggest stars in the world are. In those days, it was bands that like you wouldn't really expect. They might have been big in London, but they weren't necessarily the stars that you would think would headline a huge festival. You know, it's kind of funny because, I mean, like you look back at like Glastonbury, you know, and that was always like either Dylan or the Who or the Rolling Stones or something like that. And you look at the Reading festivals that are described in the book, and it's like Rory Gallagher or Marillion or something like that.
Well, because they were all marquee bands.
If you step back and look at it, it seems odd that's who the festival chose. I mean,
yeah.
I understand why, but like from a punter's point of view, it's like this is not the biggest band in the world that I'm going to see at this huge festival. You know, that I'm going to sit in the mud for 3 days.
I think it just got a reputation for having good music when it started, because the Marquee was at the cutting edge, less so in the 1980s. But if you go back to the 60s, the bands that were there were the bands that were kind of at the forefront of British music. The Stones didn't play any of the the Stones played in Richmond rather, but Reading, and by the time it got to Reading in the late 60s, the festival had been associated with bands like the Who, the Yardbirds, the Stones. So I think there was an expectation that you would be seeing the next big thing. Uh-huh. For instance, Cream played their first gig at Windsor. This was Harold's Festival, the Marquee Festival at Windsor before it went to Reading. Also, Fleetwood Mac played their first gig also at Windsor. So I think the festivals that Harold put on at Reading, they had a reputation for being the best up-and-coming bands. If you wanted to catch what was going to be the next big thing, you went to the festival. And then later on, the booking policy did change slightly because they did start to book bigger acts. I mean, Harold, when he started the Jazz Festival in 61, it was traditional jazz, the likes of Humphrey Littleton and Kenny Baker, who not even your dad, your granddad might know. Kenny Barber and Kenny Baker.
Oh, really? Okay. Kenny Baker, I don't know. Okay.
Chris Barber and Kenny Baker.
Okay, sorry.
So that's where Harold started. His very last festival before he kind of let go of Reading and sold it on, the headline act was Nirvana. So you go from Humphrey Littleton to Nirvana.
So how did Paradise Road come to publish a book about the Marquee?
Because it's my publishing company and I publish what the hell I like. And I was always a big fan of the Marquee. I love the Marquee. I had this publishing company, and basically I have the luxury to be able to publish books about subjects I want to read about in the expectation that other people will also want to read them.
Naturally.
And so I'd publish a bunch of books, and I decided that the next book I wanted to do was the Marquee. And so I spoke to the Pendletons. Harold, as I said, was already dead, but his wife, Barbara, was still around, and the son, Nick. And I said, I'd love to do the book on the Marquee. And they said, well, you're too late because somebody's already written that book. So I left it alone. And then a year later, this book still hadn't appeared. So I went back to the Pendletons, said, what's happened? And they said, we don't know. We'll put you in touch with the author, which they did. And it turned out the author could not find himself a publisher. His agent had failed to find a publisher for the book. So I made him an offer, and he decided to let Paradise Road publish the book, which I was delighted by.
That's great. Paradise Road specializes in books about London and I guess the city's role in popular culture. I really enjoyed your book about Denmark Street. I thought that was fascinating. The history of the music street of London. And there's the book you did about Richmond, Raving on Thames, is also really good because it kind of shows that the roots of British rock and roll took place in that particular borough with the Railway Hotel and places like that. It's great. What's coming up for Paradise Road in the future?
The very next book is a similar sort of theme. As you say, we kind of found our way. We now specialize in books about London, but specifically music and counterculture. So our next book, which should be out in the next few months, is on the psychedelic scene that sort of took place in London from 66 to 68. And that was like focused on two clubs in particular, one called UFO and one called Middle Earth, plus another venue, the Roundhouse, which still exists as a gig venue today. And kind of the house bands of these three venues were really Pink Floyd and Soft Machine, although you also got bands like The Move and Hendrix playing there. And so this is going to be our first full colour book because an important part of the scene was the graphics, the posters and the flyers, this psychedelic explosion of art. So the book's going to be telling the story of how this scene emerged, the clubs where it took place, the people who shaped the scene, some of whom are still around now, and the graphics that were associated with it. And then after that, we have commissioned books on a history of Ronnie Scott's, the jazz club in Soho, which has been around since the mid-50s, the UK's premier jazz club, and possibly something on the folk scene, which was also set in Soho.
It's kind of amazing how many books have been written now or are being written about particular venues. Trouser Press Books republished the book about CBGB, and we published the American edition of the Marquee book. There's books about the Stone Pony in Asbury Park, and there's dozens of them. I mean, it's just incredible. Like, you could do a bookshelf of books about venues, and, they're all full of great stories because the venues themselves create great stories. I mean, their histories are incredible because of who passed through them, what happened there, the music that was made there, and I think there should be more of them. So if your city has a really great venue, write a book about it. So as I say, the Marquee book is published by Paradise Road in London and Trouser Press Books in New York. And I would like to thank Andrew for coming on today. And that concludes the first Trouser Press Books podcast.
Okay.